Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 9, and we have a very special guest, Marc Lambourne. Marc has decades of experience in the wagering world. He has a plethora of knowledge from odds to markets, and also shares some of the secrets he uses to make a living in the horse racing world. Marc was kind enough to share his number one form factor when it comes to handicapping, and some useful tips for the casual punter. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Marc Lambourne. Marc, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jake. It's a great thing that you're doing.
So Marc, and I know a lot of the listeners will know who you are pretty well, but just in case there's one or two out there who don't, do you want to just go through a little bit about you and your background, how you got to where you are today?
I've been on Sydney racetracks for 35 years, so I guess that's given me a bit of a sort of a stature, I suppose. Look, I first got interested in racing back in the 1972 Melbourne Cup. I was 7 years old. I remember thinking that this horse Gunsynd, I somehow knew of him. I'm not sure how I knew of him, but I knew he was one of those champion racehorses. And it was about the time that kids start picking their football teams. I'd chosen the Dragons, the St George Rugby League team, which I also somehow knew to be one of those great teams. And I had this idea that there were similar horses around, and that sort of introduced me to the world of horse racing, the fact that there were these horses of great stature and calibre. And I remember thinking sort of a couple of years later in the 1975 Melbourne Cup that, you know, this is quite an interesting thing. There was a champion race mare by the name of Leilani around that time. Bart Cummings had just won yet another. In fact, Think Big had just won his second Melbourne Cup, and those particular horses piqued my interest. And at about that time, there were also a couple of my colleagues in primary school who were boasting about their prowess on Saturdays at the local tab. They would get there with their parents, and their parents would put a few bets on for them, and apparently they were picking winners left, right and centre. So that Christmas holidays, I sat down and I pulled my dad used to buy the Australian newspaper. We lived in the country, and I pulled out the form guide. I remember the date. It was January the 10th, 1976. And I sat down and I thought, well, look, I'm going to have a look at this. I was interested in facts, figures, numbers. I won't say I was a mathematician, but I was certainly good at maths. And I was intrigued by the codes and the symbols and the fact that back in 1976 racing was still front and centre as far as Australian culture was concerned. Whilst it was considered a touch lowbrow, it was certainly well entrenched in the way that we lived. Obviously, horse racing was broadcast on many radio stations. The public broadcaster actually showed the Daily Double live, so they'd break into whatever they were playing at the time to actually show the legs of the Daily Double. At night time, they'd also do the same with the Harold Park Trots. Unthinkable now, I know, but back in that time, it was quite accessible, horse racing. So anyway, I sat down there with my form guide and attempted to figure it out, and that led me on a journey that's taken me some 40 years later, deep into the recesses of what makes horse racing tick, or particularly what makes horse racing form tick. So back in my junior days, I experimented with systems. I scoured the place for any systems books that were around. Obviously, they were fairly rudimentary. Don Scott hadn't written his books at that stage, but by the time Don came along, I was hungry for more, and weight ratings were in the ascendancy. And so I got right into basically digging around horses' form the way that I had learned through some of those texts. I believe I became aware of the fact that Rem Plant had predated Don by some time, but was less well known, and he'd written some sort of similar types of theories, basically around weight. So I got to the racetrack as a 17-year-old in Sydney, keen to get a foothold in there. I was at university, but I was hoping to get a clerking job to pay my way, and fortunate enough at the age of 17 to get a job. And that was pretty much it for me, because whilst I was technically at uni for the next 3 or 4 years, I'd just fallen completely in love with the racecourse. Back in the early 80s, it was just full of personalities. There were lots of young kids like me that were all ardent, enthusiastic, just soaking in the atmosphere of the racetrack back then, because whilst the crowds had started to dwindle, they were still quite sizable. There was many bookies. There was 100 or so bookies on Sydney Metropolitan racetracks, several enclosures. They'd closed the flat some 7 years before, but there was still the ledger in operation, and it was the only place. It was a place where you could actually drown in that stuff, because whilst the tab was now had a strong foothold, the idea of off-course racing for anybody that was seriously interested was unthinkable. So for the next, I suppose, 15 years, the racetrack was the only place to be. I'd managed to do a little bit of bookmaking, which I saw as a necessary apprenticeship. I loved bookmaking. I only did it on the provincial courses, but formed a close relationship with a rails bookmaker by the name of Peter Todd, who was very, very highly regarded. And he sort of acted as my mentor. I was his protege, and I went on a steep learning curve. Just one of those situations where, because you're so into something, you just cannot seek and learn enough. And I've pretty much had that attitude throughout my racing career. I just cannot get enough of whatever anyone else is thinking or doing, and I think it's very important to be within the community in order to access that. A significant change that I learned in the late 90s was that when things had sort of taken a bit of a right-hand turn, there was an organisation called Humbleton that was advertising in the Sportsman, and so I went along to this symposium where they were basically interviewing sort of likely candidates for the positions they had on offer, and I suddenly became aware that there was this whole community outside the racetrack that knew some very, very clever stuff. In fact, I was amazed at this meeting I went to, that there were people that really knew aspects of horse racing that I considered had only pertained to the racetrack previously. The community that I'd been in on the racetrack, we considered ourselves cutting edge, and we would sort of like throw around these theories. There were I was, let's say, in a group of half a dozen that I would communicate throughout the course of the race meeting, and we just try and make sense of what was going on and what was to come. And it was that continual sort of thrashing around that continually enhanced our knowledge and understanding. And so I considered that there were a chosen few on the racetrack that had this knowledge that the public couldn't possibly understand, that they were still stuck with their truisms of days gone by, and we'd access the darker secrets of the track. But then I became aware that there's clever people everywhere. Racing might be on the slide, but there's a ton of clever people in the racing industry, and I suppose it was at that point that I realised that in order to turn a dollar on horse racing, you actually needed to butt heads with all these very, very clever people, and we were looking at an ever dwindling pie. So basically, from the mid-90s, it became aware that bookmaking bookmakers were dropping like flies. The pros were eating each other, and it had become a situation where there was there was no more fill in the racing industry. Obviously, people like Jelco and Co worked out that the place to go was to seek rebates on the tab, and it was becoming a marginal game. But because you love the game so much, you just can't think of playing anything else. And so for the last 15 years, I've, I guess, perhaps moved to, obviously, it's been about accessing the corporate landscape that's come into play. But I see myself now also as someone that wants to either access or recreate some sort of online learning community that disseminates and discusses cutting-edge form information and betting information. That's where I see myself now, Jake.
So how have you seen trying to recreate that sort of vibrant culture and marketplace from the 70s and 80s and when it started to dwindle through the 90s and onwards? Are you, obviously you have the videos that you put out through the Racing Rant, and have you utilized that as a way to try and recreate something that was of that vibrant culture in the olden days, or is it much too difficult to do that?
It's a recreation of a sort. Obviously, that being with people in the flesh is far different, but we have what we have, and obviously it's an awesome tool that technology has given us to enable us to reach out around the globe for for people that share your passion, and that is incredibly useful. People have obviously got to find you, and you've got to find them, but nevertheless, it's a new world. It's just a different world, and obviously we're sharing with people that are at different points on the spectrum. But look, it's pretty exciting to interact and engage with people that share your passion.
So you touched on it a little bit earlier about the marketplace as it was and a few of the developing trends and some of the changes. What have been some of the main, I guess, differences from you mentioned the 1972 Melbourne Cup through to the 80s and then towards now? Have the changes been just cosmetic and the underlying principles remain the same, or have there been marked shifts over the last few decades?
It's changed radically and totally. So prior to my time, bookmaking was all about facilitating. There were two types of punters. There were the recreational punter and the professional punter. And it was almost as if the bookmaker and the professional punter were in bed together. They were sharing the proceeds from the recreational punters. And the professional punters respected the bookmakers. There was a reciprocal arrangement there. So as that recreational money started to disappear from the racetrack, and it obviously started with the advent of the tab in 1964, so it became that relationship between the bookmaker and the pro punter started to change, because suddenly the bookmaker was unable to facilitate the whole thing as well. The pro punter started to eat into his margins, and there was an antithetical sort of aspect to that relationship that grew. So we reached the situation on the track where bookmakers started to become sceptical of the pro punters. Pro punters were started acting more aggressively towards the bookmakers, and it imploded. That bring on the online revolution. And the first corporate bookmaker that I recall was Mark Reed's Darwin All Sports, and that was actually quite an interesting development, because Mark was basically setting out as an educator, saying, "Well, look, in order for us to have a game, we need to educate our customers." But unfortunately, his lead was not followed at all. So the subsequent corporate bookmakers that set up, they were seeking to regain access to the recreational money by dint of the fact that they had a wider access, but they were coming to that game with the view that the professional punters were evil, So rather than professional punters help me to set my book, help me to establish what's what. It's the professional punters are the devil, and they're just there to corrode my margins. We then saw some 10 to 15 years after that the fact that the English corporates or the European corporates came to Australia, and I suspect they were looking at our parimutuel setup and thinking, wow, the parimutuel has such a large market share. Obviously, all those people need is one of us to bet with, and they'll come over to us. We can aggressively poach them. There's that huge market that's just waiting to bet with an international bookmaker. And I think I presume that that's what they were thinking, and I think they were wrong in that thinking. But nevertheless, they came in, soaked up whatever corporate bookmakers were for sale. In fact, that's fairly sort of standard international procedure where you start an organisation that's successful for a while, but then you realise that it's either get bigger or pump yourself up for a sale. And a number of the bookmakers in Australia saw that opportunity. And so we had a situation where the established Ladbrokes and Paddy Powers and William Hills of this world came in and took over the Australian bookmaking operations, and they came in with their own viewpoint, certainly enhanced by the fact that the corporate landscape in Australia was not interested in entertaining a professional marketplace. And we've reached a situation today where there's a very, very uneasy alliance. Well, it's not an alliance really, but it's an uneasy relationship between the pros and the corporate bookmakers. And so I would say that in the 50 years that I've spoken about, that it's the whole thing has changed from a game for everyone to an adversarial type situation where it's a constant tension between the bookmakers and the passionate pros.
So I want to touch on what you just mentioned about some of the strategy of the bookmakers and corporate bookmaking. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment, and let's flip the script a little bit. So you and I are starting a bookmaking business. We're coming into the Australian landscape. We have a good, solid foundation of what the history has been. Why would it be useful for the bookmakers to befriend the professionals and take them on? These bookmaking companies obviously have some smart people, and they would have considered the best approach. Is it a higher risk approach for them to accept a lot of these professional wages and accept a lot of these syndicates and their different betting strategies? And if so, they've obviously decided not to, but do you think that is an easy option? Because I would imagine you need to hire a lot of talented bookmakers or people involved in setting the markets and moving the odds and being there on race day, and that's probably not cheap. And the current scenario and the option they've gone with is probably cheaper and I would imagine risk-free. Is that correct, or have I sort of misinterpreted a little bit?
Well, you've got to accept the fact that these guys, the pro punters, are clever and they will find ways around. So if you're going to be running a constant battle, then you're going to be fighting on many fronts. The way it once was back in the olden days, it's all about volume. So it's about finding enough volume in the game to accommodate this scenario, so you engage with the player rather than battle with the player. So once upon a time, the little country bookmaker in Dubbo, he would set his stand at the races there every Saturday. They were non-tab meetings, but they had good local custom. He would get a call from Ray Hopkins in Sydney or Laurie Bricknell on the Gold Coast. And this was on race morning. The country bookmaker didn't really have a great idea of what price to offer these punters on a race that was going to happen in Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne later that day, but there'd be a negotiation. And the country bookie might say, yes, Ray, you can have 5,000 to 1,000 XYZ in race 5 today at Randwick. And what that country bookmaker would use with that information was that he would have a very strong opinion about how that horse was going to trade in the marketplace, because he had just bought some incredible information that he would never have had access to otherwise. So he would go to the races that day, and there would be another dozen bookmakers there at Dubbo, and he might back that horse with those bookmakers in the knowledge that it was very, very strongly fancied. Whether or not he might have had to pay a fine, he may not have got his the money that he'd offered the pro punter at the price. He may not have got that, but he's bought that knowledge. It's priceless knowledge, and he's prepared to go with it. Or he may have an opinion strongly against that horse, and he may use that knowledge to market or to lay that horse at a shorter price, knowing that it's going to firm because it's got this strong pro opinion behind it. So that was the way it used to work, where the bookmaker harnessed the knowledge of the pro punter and attempted to use it to his advantage. Mark Reed, when he started his corporate bookmaking, also had the same idea. He would play these pro punters, profile them, and then attempt to go with them to a small or large degree, depending on how he's assessed their acuity. So that is one model, and safe to say it's not applied very widely these days. Now, if you and I are setting up a bookmaking business, firstly, there are a lot of bookmakers around, and whilst they're wary of taking bets, the fact is that you will be able to create some volume just simply by the range of the number of bookmakers there are, even if they're not betting you very large amounts. So we're going to set up relationships with the pro punters that come to us, and we're going to say, look, we recognise that it's almost more valuable for us to get your information than to employ a huge team to try and recreate that information. So we're perhaps going to have a small team, a small sharp team behind us, but we're going to have a foundation, and then you're going to come to us. We're going to let you on for a reasonable amount, and we're going to attempt to use that information in the marketplace. And that's, whilst it is a smallish game, unless we engage all the players, there's no hope of it growing.
Yep. So we don't necessarily need to employ Peter Todd, Dominic Byrne, and Mark Reed from day one and have them sort of running things internally. We can gather the market intelligence and the information from those we've profiled and use that as one of our main tools, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a sensible way to go, because why attempt to fight them off when you know that they're going to be in the marketplace somewhere? Cultivate that relationship. We don't want them sort of sending what are known as bowlers in, who are supposedly people that we don't know that they're betting for. We actually want almost a face-to-face engagement with them.
Yep. Okay. One more question on the bookmaking specific side. You mentioned rebates from the TAB. For those who don't know, why did the TAB do it? And are there any, perception issues or even ethical issues, public facing in doing so?
Yes, and yes. It's one of those situations where I suppose commercially, forever and a day, businesses have recognised that if they've got large volume, large custom, that they're prepared to offer discounts to those large customers. So it goes on in a widespread fashion. The TABs have a monopoly on the high street in Australia, so they're the only ones that are allowed to conduct business in public areas. So they had an advantageous selling position in the first place. They also have a legislated takeout. So they're taking out between 15 and 25%, depending on the betting option. And they're required, obviously, to give a portion of that back to the racing industry, and that's the racing industry's funding model until Racefield's legislation came along. And they're prepared to trade away some of that legislated edge in return for more volume, because their business model was, well, we want to grow turnover, because obviously higher turnover means higher profit in their situation, because they're not compromising their margin for higher volume.
Yep.
But they also reached a stage where it started to flatline, particularly with the online bookmaking phenomenon. They were attempting to poach the TAB's customers. They may have even been offering to bet them TAB prices, which was another battle that took place. And so we have a situation where the TABs are going, well, how do we increase our volume? Well, we'll offer some discounts to the big players, and I suppose that is seen as a commercial reality. As far as you've got a legislated body that is supposedly offering a product to the public that can't be competed with on one level. It is a bit ethically problematic, that arrangement. So obviously people have spoken about that. It is in existence. I understand the business model, and the big players that have sort of grown in the last 10 to 15 years have seen that as an obvious place to play to get the discount in order to offset the edge. They recognise that they can overcome a 10% edge, but they can't overcome a 15% edge. So that's the way it's gone.
Okay. And this race fields legislation, what is the genesis of it, and why is it only applicable to racing? Is it something that's deeply embedded and therefore it's able to exist? Because there's obviously no, rugby legislation or Australian football legislation in order for them and those leagues to get a piece of the pie. Can you just, and I'm not sure how deep your understanding is of the race fields legislation, but how did that all come about?
We started with the position where, as I mentioned before, that the TAB was the guaranteed take from the TAB was funding racing. Bookmakers, on-course bookmakers, paid a turnover tax to the local club, and also to the state, the treasury, the state government. And once that situation began to change and corporate bookmaking got a hold and started aggressively taking market share away from certainly the on-course bookmakers and eventually the TAB, racing was obviously at some sort of a crisis point, because they could see their, and this is especially pertinent when Betfair came along, they could see their funding model under threat. So they were, I suppose, looking at ways that they could get some of that revenue from the corporate bookmakers. And interestingly, they started off on the wrong foot, because the corporate bookmakers that set up in the late 90s, early 2000s were seen as the devil, and they were not welcome, certainly in New South Wales. So the Northern Territory sensed a business opportunity, and they set up sympathetic arrangements whereby the corporate bookmakers could be registered in Northern Territory. So they're on Australian soil, so they're all good. But unfortunately, New South Wales has no access to them in terms of taxes or any type of revenue. So mid-2000s, Racing New South Wales, I don't know whether they came up with the idea or whatever, but they managed to institute an arrangement where if they claimed copyright on the horses' names that they put together. So they were responsible for taking acceptances and publishing the names, and so they asserted some sort of copyright over those names, and clearly that was legally strong enough to prevent entities that weren't registered in New South Wales from having to pay some sort of licence fee to use those race fields. So thankfully, they did find a way to actually claw back some of the lost revenue that the corporate bookmakers had managed to garner a share of. Unfortunately, at the same time, they threw Betfair into that net, and Betfair, who only make money off the winnings of the players in the exchange, were suddenly being taxed on the on the actual matchings themselves, which made Betfair Australia instantly unviable. It forced Betfair to drive away all the arbitrages, basically call them and say, please don't bet on our markets. And so, Betfair's had its hands tied behind its back for the last 10 years. So that's where we've gone to in the racefields legislation. Now, obviously, with the introduction of a new tax, and it's pertinent to Australia because we've had discussions about raising the GST, or our sort of widespread sales tax, pretty much ever since it was instituted. Once you institute a tax, then the way forward is to actually raise that tax. So we've now seen a situation where the racing bodies have attempted to assert larger increases in the racefields tax. So they've come up with this idea that if we run a $150,000 race on a program, well, that's now a premium meeting, so we can levy a premium charge. And at carnival time, that's obviously premium time, so you should have to pay larger racefields fee, and so on and so forth. So we will see an environment where that's going to get stickier and stickier. That racing seems to have a pile of money as a result of this racefields legislation, but they will be seeking to enhance that revenue, and I imagine the corporates will start feeling the bite of that, and that will then they'll then become more aggressive in terms of attempting to drive away the customers that are eating into their margins, looking for softer and softer recreational money, which it's a fairly mature market now. So I'm not sure if there's a lot for them to find, but I think Sean Byrne touched on some of the ways forward for them to try and get the marketplace the way that is sympathetic to their bottom line. So in terms of the racefields legislation, look, it's a relatively new thing in racing. It's sort of clever, but I think racing's really missed the boat in the sense that I may have touched on in an earlier interview about the fact that most of our leakage in this industry is actually to the owners of stallions. So we've got a setup where racing is well funded, but it's totally funded by wagering. And what this wagering does is drive prize money increases, which is all lovely, but where's that prize money going? It's going into yielding prices, and high yielding prices basically benefit only one entity in the racing game, and that's the stallion owner. And since we've had shuttle stallions for the last 20 or so years, it just so happens that the owners of most of those stallions happen to reside in the Northern Hemisphere. And so this is great. We're making lots of money out of racing, and we're delivering it to Coolmore in Ireland, for example. So it's a problematic funding model in that sense that it's all directed to paying money to breeders. What we need to look at is we need to work out how to tax every single service in racing, not just the wagering service. So, for example, I sell a form product on Saturday to my customers for $80. Now I have to pay GST on that, so I'm netting $72. But I am a service provider in the racing industry, and I might be a very marginal service provider because I'm working in one of the or I'm offering a service in one of the particularly recessed areas of the racing industry. But nevertheless, I turn a dollar out of the racing industry, and I am happy to pay some sort of tax. Some sort of GST on that particular service that I offer. So the stallion owner who charges $100,000 for a service to his stallion needs to be paying something as well. So as far as I can see, the way forward for the racing industry is actually widen its base rather than concentrating on this U-Butte. We've got funding from the TAB and we've got racefields legislation.
Yep, it's a very complex topic, and I think eyes light up when they see the wagering pools in certain respects, and I think also the complexity leads to the too hard basket, dropping in there and just letting it simmer away. So I think I guess any type of change is probably going to be a difficult lobbying process, let's put it that way. I want to change tracks a little bit. You're obviously very curious in what you've sort of mentioned earlier. Hong Kong racing. do you follow it deeply, and what can be learnt from Hong Kong? And they seem to be, world leading in so many respects.
So you look across at Hong Kong in awe, and I have done ever since I became aware of them, the beast. Look, they're focused very differently, and obviously they've got a very, very sympathetic setup where they import all their talent. So it's like a super league, and they don't have to do any grassroots at all, other than to make sure that their millions of punters are fed appropriately. So they've got the best of all setups in that they don't have to. They obviously pay big dollars for the horses and the jockeys and the trainers, but they've got a setup where they can control racing so neatly and offer a product that is so palatable. And they're totally mindful of who their product is directed at, and that's the punters. So they make all their money from wagering. And they're very focused on the wagering customer. They want to offer them the best possible product. They want to make sure that they're informed as much as possible. They recognise, what their customers want. And so it's an easy setup, but they're also very customer focused. And so since my media career began 20 years ago, I've sort of banged on about the fact that, look, here's the model. We just need to try and mimic Hong Kong in whatever way we can. Obviously, we've got a setup that is not as amenable, but so structurally we're very different. But they've got a focus that we don't, and their focus has meant that they've had volume that we could only dream of. And it's that volume that enables their game to be so bright and shiny. And it's obviously attracted, worldwide attention, that volume. If you want a game to play, then you've got to have a size like that.
So on that tact a little bit, the idiosyncrasies between the jurisdictions on the track. So for example, you'll see in different jurisdictions outside of Australia, jockeys happy to sit 3 wide from the 1,000 meter mark and build up the momentum of the horse. In Australia, that would be suicide. How is it that all these different jurisdictions can have these different nuances? And I'm not sure if it's better or worse in any type of jurisdiction. If you rode the Australian style in Europe, would that be effective, or vice versa? It seems like in the Melbourne Cup every year you have an Irish jockey on an English horse who takes off, and they're usually pretty short in the market and don't seem to be able to hit the finish line. Is that something that is, I guess, particular to the individual jurisdiction?
It would seem to be. So I haven't scoured the world, admiring the local style, but it would appear that a visiting jockey does need to recognise the way that races are configured in that jurisdiction. So I would suggest that the style that is best suited to the locals is the style that needs to be adopted. Obviously, you can bring some of your nuance to that, but in the main, it would appear that that when in Rome, you need to act like the Romans. So we had an example 2 years ago where Godolphin imported 2 of their English riders to ride during our autumn carnival in Sydney, and I would say they were less than effective. We had a situation where James Doyle returned 18 months later with the benefit of that experience, and he was a sensation. So it would seem to me that instantly or significantly in the beginning, riders will bring their own style. I mean, they're not going to know how to ride any differently, and that will be some sort of disadvantage for the horses that they're riding. But once they adapt to the local style, and as I say, they can bring their own peculiarities to that particular style. But once they recognise that a style is most suited to, or the local style is most suited to the local racing, then I think they can prosper. So I would suggest that there will obviously be exceptions to that theory, but it's about it's about sort of recognising that the local style is best suited for a long-standing reason. It's clearly got to do with the way races are run in that jurisdiction.
You've obviously got factors and variables and styles and all those types of things. It must drive you mad sometimes, or is that what you love about it as well?
Look, that's what's so bloody juicy and delicious about this game is that there is no one factor. I mean, obviously there are edges in single factors, but it is a dynamic organism, and that's what's been inherently enticing to me is that there's just so many different attributes, and it's a challenge that has so many faces that it's it's vexing, but it's as I say, it's a delicious pursuit.
Can you take me through how you go about assessing jockeys and also weight?
Okay, jockeys are one of those self-fulfilling things where a jockey is seen to have ability, becomes in demand. He then is positioned on the better horses with the better chances. He comes to believe that he's on a better chance in the race, rides it accordingly, and you find the apex of the pyramid when it comes to jockeys are the very successful area of jockeyship. So that seems quite obvious to me that the differences in ability in the jockeys may not be that great, but they're magnified by the way the situation plays out. Weight is one of those things which I obviously started with because back in the early 80s, weight was king, and it was the one piece of data that you could actually get your hands on, and most of the systems, or the elaborate systems at the time, manipulated weights in order to arrive at some sort of market outcome. Over time, I've been persuaded of the view that it's a far more dynamic thing than that sort of rudimentary quantification that we find across the marketplace. So you'll still find everybody in the mainstream media going, well, such and such is meeting such and such 2 kilos better and whatever. I think that's it's wasteful talk, or it's wasteful analysis. What really concentrated my mind was, I think, back in the early 90s, I saw a situation where horse A was meeting horse B significantly better at the weights, and what happened in that situation was not only was everyone aware of the significant weight shift, but the tactics employed actually brought it to a fait accompli almost. So what happens with significant weight shifts is that all the players believe in these weight shifts, and so they come true. X horse is lightly weighted. The connections are positive about the horse. They employ positive tactics on the horse. Horse B is poorly weighted, perceived to be poorly weighted. Suddenly everyone's very reserved and they take a very sort of negative approach when it comes to positioning the horse. Oh, we don't want to ask this horse to do much because it's so poorly weighted. So weights it's very important to be conscious of what is perceived to be well weighted and well weighted and badly weighted, but that in of itself won't create the result. What it will do is it will influence the way the match progresses, or the way the way that the race is in fact viewed and attacked by the participants.
Yeah, I think weight and jockeys will be debated forevermore, and as long as we have horse racing, we're going to have jockeys and weights, so I think it'll be a factor forever. Can you touch on a little bit about Victoria and New South Wales, Melbourne and Sydney racing? They obviously both compete in different ways, and there's different styles in each state and each track and those type of things. Can you tell me how you handle horses going from Melbourne to Sydney and vice versa?
So let's start with the fundamentals of racing in Australia. Horses in New South Wales are better bred, more expensive horses. So you'll find the pool of horses in Sydney is a superior pool to the pool of horses in Melbourne. Now, that's obviously not the end of it. But that's part of the reason why it is difficult for Victorians to compete in the Sydney arena with a great degree of success. Obviously, they then need situations, or the situation to be favourable in some other way. Now, we had a recent experience in the autumn where the Victorians performed better than usual, and the prevailing wisdom seemed to be that Sydney's autumn was very wet. Victorian autumn is typically dry, and those horses were having far better preparations, and then coming to Sydney and being able to succeed by virtue of their better preparation. That's possible. It could also be that those horses came to Sydney with form on firm ground, and I've found that the best form is obviously form on firm ground, because more of the horses in a race are competitive. So you'll find that form on wet ground is suspect simply because there are fewer horses competitive in that situation. So it could even have been not so much that the horses were fitter, but that they were fitter in a competitive sense, because they'd been running in races that involved more competition. Sydney to Melbourne is particularly fertile because we see a lot of that in the spring, where the Sydney spring is sort of up and running a bit earlier than the Melbourne spring. Obviously, the Melbourne spring has got a longer lead time, and because of the inherent advantage that Sydney horses have, they go to Melbourne, and certainly for the first few weeks, particularly the first few weeks of October, they make a mess of Melbourne. They've really got quite a competitive advantage there.
Yeah, some really useful info, especially springtime when you've got 18 horse fields and you're trying to work out last minute who you're going to have a small bet on after you've had a couple of drinks. But yeah, certainly some good information there. Can I just ask you, once you've done the form and you've done the handicapping and you've got maybe some prices in your own market, how do you go about attacking the real marketplace and the odds and some of the things you think about when you're post-form and you're looking at what the market is doing and where you think it will go?
So I'll give you an example from yesterday, where there was a market posted on Wednesday for Rosehill races on Saturday, and there were four horses predominantly in the market. So there was one horse at $3.50. There was another horse at $6 and two horses at $8. Now, I identified the $6 and the two horses at $8 to be a bit mythical as far as the market was concerned. Two of them were resumers, and the marketplace is particularly critical of resumers. Whilst they can be fashionable and backable, the fact is that once you get a little bit older, the market will be extremely hard on resumers. And the other horse was a talented 3-year-old that had gone a bit missing. He'd been out of the jurisdiction, he'd gone away and failed, and there was a major query over him. So there's four horses making up the market. I identified three of them to be quite soft, which immediately made me feel that the 5-2, the $3.50 chance would in fact be $2.80 come post time. And it's that sort of situation. You're aware of the way the market works. You're aware of the aspects of the horse's form, and you say, well, the market is going to head in this direction with this horse, and is likely to head in this direction with the horse that's got the more positive attributes. And I see that as a way to, as certainly my way or my preferred MO, where I know the horse's form well enough, I know the way the market operates or assesses or approaches or positions these horses, and so I'm able to make a judgment about where the market will shift.
That's as good as insight as you get into how in-depth you need to know the form and the forces that are at play in the market, and obviously the type of thinking you need to be on the same level as the professionals that you're essentially betting with and against in those marketplaces. So yeah, really deep insight and great knowledge there. Can you also maybe touch on a couple of we mentioned some of the international factors and styles, and maybe some of the things that you use, some tools and things that help you when you're doing the form, which you value highly and help you on a race by race or week by week basis.
So I've spent my life focused on Sydney racing, and so I don't claim to have a great knowledge of racing outside of that area, and there are things that I do in relation to the horses I look at that will be applicable worldwide, but there are other things that are idiosyncratic and are about knowing a particular track or knowing a particular riding style or knowing the climate of that area, for example. But there is one universal tool, and it took me a long time to understand its significance, and that is the starting price. Now, there may be peculiarities in the collection of starting prices depending on where you are, but in the main, the starting price is supposed to represent the consensus of all the players. Everyone's had their say, and they've had their say using their money. So it's not, they're not words, they're acts. So we have this consensus, which is the starting price. You may line that up with the Betfair starting price or the final tab price, whatever you want to use. There's an indication of what was expected of a horse in that situation. And it's obviously governed by the conditions that reigned at that time. So, a starting price on a heavy track it needs to be mindful that it is a heavy track starting price, but it is the expectation of how that horse was going to perform that day. Now, you run the race, and you run the race only once. And that's not really, that's actually rarely going to be a great indication of how those horses fitted together. Look, it may be all right, but you've got a tool there in the starting price, which was the expectation of how that horse was going to perform. And it's a bit like, your expectation of the coin toss. You know that the fair coin has the 50% probability of either side. And so when you've seen 10 heads in a row, which can clearly happen, nevertheless, you know that the expectation of tails remains 50%. So it's that expectation you can underpin your form with. And what really got me started on that was when I started examining head-to-head performances. So I'd do a head-to-head printout of the horses that I was looking at, and I'd comb that head-to-head, and I'd marvel at the fact that that horses that started particular prices against each other. So the shorter horse would next start longer than the other horse and yet beat it home. Whereas that position had been reversed previously. So I sort of started to marvel on the fact that this expectation needed to underpin your assessment of the coming race. So if horse A was expected to beat horse B, that is, it had a shorter starting price last time, then all things considered, it should be expected to beat horse B again tomorrow, irrespective of what happened in that one instance of where they ran together. So when I finally realised, sort of 20 years into my form research, that starting price was the number one form factor, then suddenly I could start to build up my form assessment arsenal in what I consider to be an appropriate way. So that's yeah. Sorry,
so how
Jake.
do you battle the cognitive biases that sort of afflict the human brain and the human condition? Because if you do have a horse that is, a 50% chance of winning, and perhaps it runs, last, for example, and we've discussed previously about form being a dynamic instrument, and you've got to be able to adapt in certain circumstances. How do you balance or control that cognitive aspect?
Well, I suppose that, the emphasis on that expectation is an attempt to rein in, the cognitive tendency to run away with what you've seen. I heard Ralphie mention very vehemently about the fact that the eye lies, and it's a very interesting idea. As humans, we are we're prey to running away with our emotions and what we perceive, and it's very important, and various clever people have constructed other means of reining themselves in. So I would suggest that it is very important to recognise that what you see or what you perceive or what you've witnessed is not necessarily a truth.
So how do you utilise the SP, the starting price? Do you take it as gospel and are strictly confined to what the SP was, or do you have some type of repricing strategy that you use as well?
I have a very, very rudimentary algorithm that I run on a starting price, and I'm basically using a class rating, joining that with the starting price, and using that to produce a rating, so that it's a class rating that's amended for starting price, and it's sort of loose in the sense that you've suggested that starting price is subject to a fashion, I suppose. It's not the. I presented it as the Holy Grail. What I perhaps should have said is that it's the linchpin of our racing, of our form analysis. So I can then match horses against each other based on that sort of amended class rating. So a horse that starts even money in a particular grade, irrespective of its performance, needs to have a better rating than a horse that starts 10 to 1 in that grade, because clearly their capabilities, as reflected by that starting price, are significantly different.
On a different tact, what about trainers? How do you incorporate or factor in trainers? Obviously in Victoria you've got the explosion of Darren Weir in recent times. I guess Sydney has been dominated by Chris Waller and obviously Gai Waterhouse in recent times. As an example, Gai Waterhouse, how do you incorporate or factor in, if at all, or if how much, sort of her as a trainer as a variable?
So different trainers have different styles, and I would suggest that Gai is perhaps more potent in the betting market than Chris Waller, who, by sheer dint of numbers and the fact that he's able to attract the best talent onto his horses, and he obviously prepares his horses extremely well. But Gai has a particular style of horses being put into the race. They're aggressively ridden, they take up a forward position, and by dint of that, they're able to own races in the way that that Chris, who tends to be more conservative, has his horses ridden off the speed. They need circumstances to work for them. So from a betting point of view, you can be far more gung-ho about assessing a Waterhouse horse than you perhaps would be about a Waller horse. But nevertheless, the point is, so aside from that nuance, what it is about these large successful stables is that it becomes self-fulfilling, because they attract the best riders and they are seen to be the best chances, and so all the connections are supremely confident about what will happen in relation to these particular horses. The jockeys go out confident, they ride confidently, the trainers are confident, they prepare their horses confidently. There's a lot of expectation going into the contest that influences the result of the contest. All that intention is positive intention, and it needs to be acknowledged by the form student.
So while we're on the topic of form, can you give sort of the casual bettors who might have a $10 or $50 bet once a week on a weekend or a race meeting, have you got any sort of, I guess, a shortened form guide that they could use when they're at the TAB, when they're at a racetrack or something like that? Are there any sort of tools that they could utilize to do a sort of a 10-minute form study and I guess enhance their chances of winning on that day?
All right, so they may need to do a little bit of study, but let's say that they're looking at that form guide, and I want you to focus on a horse's last start, and I want you to look at any horses that are said to race second to the turn in their races. So the form guide will say, settled third, second turn. So any horse that's positioned in second place on the turn, and if you're able to deduce whether it was a fast or slow run race, then you can concentrate on the faster run races where the horse was doing a bit more work when it was chasing the leader. So basically we're looking for a subset of horses that are sitting outside the lead, preferably in a fast run race at their last start, and I would suggest that that's a rudimentary system that you could use to some success.
What's the rationale or the logic behind that?
So it's a position where the horse is not in control of the pace, so it's being asked to work possibly harder than it would like to, but the work that it's doing in that race, the stress that it's encountering in that run, is priming it to such a degree that it will render it more competitive at its next start. So all athletic contests require stress to bring your performance level forward, and that's why we work horses. Well, that's why all athletes train, in fact, and that's why we give them progressively more stressful tests. So in the case of racehorses, we jump them out of the barriers. Well, that in itself is stressful. And so we subject them to the stress of competition, and they're innately competitive beasts. And by subjecting them to more and more stress, it brings their performance level, or it pushes them higher and higher until obviously the horse has had enough and is in need of a break or a freshen up or spell, whatever a horse is required to recover its energy levels. But yeah, the idea is that a more stressful performance in a race will result in a better performance given sort of sympathetic running conditions next time.
And what's one thing that if you were allowed to, you would rip out of the form guide so that no one would ever see it again, that is useless or irrelevant or something that just shouldn't be in there? If you picked up a Best Bets or the newspaper on a Saturday and there was one thing, what would that be?
It would be the M in the form guide. It depends, it might be an M or a W, but it denotes a horse that's won on a wet track. And I really think that punters are completely misled by this idea that there are wet trackers. So obviously horses are retarded when the going becomes inferior, and all horses get slower. Some horses aren't slowed up as much as other horses, so it becomes a sort of a different contest. But there's this idea that in order to play wet tracks, you need to look for wet trackers, and I consider that enormously wrong-headed. I think that obviously wet tracks create a different contest, but the idea that because a horse has won a race on a wet track, that makes it a significant chance in an upcoming race on a wet track is an inflation, a ridiculous inflation. It may bear some relevance to today's contest, nothing like the relevance that it's accorded. And you get a situation where people become quite perturbed and disaffected by wet tracks. We saw a track at Randwick last Saturday where people were moaning and groaning because the wet trackers failed on this particular track. And it's a one-trick pony, this wet track idea, that you can class horses as mudders and non-mudders. It's a variable contest, and you need to keep that in mind. And the idea, the identification of horses as mudders with the M in the form guide or the W in the form guide is a highly misleading concept. That is the one thing I'd get rid of.
Interesting, because I would imagine a vast majority of the casual punters who are betting on a wet track, that's probably the first thing they seek out. So, well,
yeah, and that's the problem. If it was the last thing they sought out, there wouldn't be a problem. That would probably be appropriate. But it is the first thing they look at. They lose complete sight of the ability of the horse.
Right. You mentioned earlier Mark Reed gave out a lot of free information, and you obviously do so yourself through the Racing Rant. What are some of the reasons why you do that? Because obviously you have credibility in the industry, and some of the things you're saying publicly through your channels is incredibly valuable, and the insights there are not necessarily rivaled by too many other people in Sydney. So do you want to take us through some of the ideas behind why you give out such great premium free content?
Because it's not available anywhere else. So unfortunately, we have a one-track media or mainstream media in racing. Once upon a time, we had, as I mentioned, there were broadcasts of races on multiple radio stations and relatively mainstream television coverage. As soon as the media became the domain of the tab, they dumbed it down to the lowest common denominator. So we have a situation where there's no insight being offered via the media. Like in our business world, you'll obviously have commentary and leaders written by people that know that have expert knowledge. Whereas in racing, there's no expert knowledge being disseminated by the mainstream media. So part of my and others' passion is actually directed at trying to create a community that can be instructive, and we're all seeking to learn off each other. I mean, nearly all of the ideas that I've expressed in this interview are not original ideas of my own. They might have been finessed by me, but I was very fortunate to have a great mentor and to have access to some great racing brains. And it's important to actually put those racing brains on show, even though technically you may be reducing your particular monetisation. If it's been an ever-shrinking game, so if it continues to shrink, there's not much point in having that edge, because the monetisation will become harder and harder as the game shrinks smaller and smaller. So Mark Reed's idea was, look, you've got to grow this pie so that I can get decent whack out of it. And whilst my thinking isn't quite the same, it is along similar lines. That this is a wonderful puzzle. It's completely obsessed me throughout my life, and I just want to introduce other people to the intricacies of this amazing thing that it has the potential to be life preserving, because obviously people end their working life and they go into retirement. They go golfing or they go gardening, whatever they do. They probably don't go bowling anymore. But to have an interest such as this, that is so attractive to the mind and so engaging of the mind, is an interest that is amazing to have as a retiree. And you can clearly devote so much more time to it then as well. So I'm attempting to educate my community. I'm hoping that my community will educate me as well, which they do. And I want to broaden that community. And let's face it, when you are passionate about something, you generally want to shout it from the rooftops, as much as it may be in your interest to not.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you mentioned about the mainstream media and perhaps avoid there, one of the first things that they would often say on a wet track is discuss what happened in the past with those horses on a wet track. So it's an interesting dynamic that you get. A couple of things you've said so highlighted in the mainstream media. Before I let you go, Mark, and I'm very grateful for your time, and I've learnt so much chatting with you. You mentioned the 72 Melbourne Cup. I have two questions. Who won the 72 Melbourne Cup, and are there any races from then until now that you like reminiscing about or talking about other than the main Melbourne Cups?
So Piping Lane, an unheralded Tasmanian, won that Melbourne Cup. Gunsynd laboured into third place. I wasn't aware at the time that Gunsynd wasn't really a stayer. He was more of a miler. But by virtue of his amazing ability, he was able to be competitive in that situation. So I think Piping Lane ran long odds in that cup, which is another of those aspects of your introduction to racing. When you see big priced winners, that's a bit of a hook. As far as other races that have particularly that I'm enamoured of, I would say that, obviously we're now in the situation where I've seen the greatest racehorse I've ever seen in Winx, who's surpassed Black Caviar amazingly. So it's sort of gobsmacking, even as an insider such as myself, to witness her performances. But from a more sort of on-the-ground perspective, there are those races where I have perceived the capabilities of a particular runner, and that has been in evidence in the race. I remember in the late 80s there was a combination. Brian Smith was training very well out of Sydney, and he brought over Marie Linden to ride for him, and that combination I sensed were particularly effective in certain situations, and whenever that would come to fruition, that was particularly satisfying. And ever since then, whatever sort of my hobby horse form aspect has been, whenever that has come good, it's intensely satisfying. So it's one of those situations that I'll enjoy in the coming years as well. You know, obviously, I made mention of a particular form aspect that I find exciting just as a one-trick pony. There'll be other things that I'll consider in the future, and I'll apply them to races. And when things work, when things appear to work result-wise, it's intensely satisfying.
So, Mark, where can people reach out to you if they want to get involved with you and hear you on a week-to-week basis and obviously get involved in that community? What's the best avenue for them?
racingrant.com. So one word, racingrant.com, and that will take you to 2 or 3 weekly videos, previewing, reviewing, lots of form discussion, interesting guests. It's highly visual. It's entertaining as well, because obviously you need to engage with your audience. And I won't say I'm the most entertaining, but we do have an entertaining panel. And marclambourne.com also has lots of stuff that I've written in the past. I wrote it for the Punters Show. The Punters Show website is still accessible and may be reharnessed in the future. So that's puntersshow.com, marclambourne.com, and most importantly, racingrant.com. You can find me on Twitter at JustIdeal, who I haven't made mention of, but Just Ideal was the first horse that I had a 25-cent win and place bet on in the tab in 1976, and he went on to win a Doncaster, and I've given he's my eponymous Twitter handle.
There you go. I think that brings up a whole bunch of questions about minimum bets and things like that, but we might just leave it there. Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to chat. All the very best to you, and hopefully we can have a further discussion down the line.
We will indeed, Jake. Thanks for that.